Hi, Elaine here from markergeek.com. Today I've got a card for you featuring a fairly new stamp set. It's the Sparkle Kit from the Greeting Farm. I get all of my Greeting Farm stamps here in the UK from Tracy at Dies to Die For. I'll leave a link in the description below and over on my blog to this kit, along with all of the other supplies that I use for this card. At the time of recording, the kit is still in stock at Dies to Die For. I do know that stocks are limited though, so if you are interested, I'd pop over and pick it up. And yeah, onto the card. I've used Distress Oxides again, as I often do recently. This time, however, I decided to give them a go and see how they work on some watercolour paper that I happen to have. Again, I'll link to this in my blog post and in the description below. I used the ink smooshing technique, as you can see, smooshed some of the ink down onto my craft mat and then picked it up with the watercolour paper. And as you can see, I'm drying between the layers. I wanted to create this piece specifically to paper piece the feathers on the character that I chose. She's got a couple of large feathers in her hair. And I wanted to create some of the fun kind of speckled splattery effects that you can get when you layer the Distress Oxides. It's one of my favourite properties of the Distress Oxides, the way that they layer so beautifully, but you do have to make sure that you dry between each layer. So I was picking up the ink, which I'd, as you could see, also spritzed with water each time to activate it, and picking up some ink and then just drying it with the heat tool before I pick up more, and it gives you this beautiful layered effect. And as you pick up the ink and you end up with less moisture on the craft mat, you end up getting this kind of speckled effect, these kind of little concentrated areas of ink, and it's just really beautiful, and it works really nicely for paper piecing. It's a technique that I use, which I showed in a blog post last year, doing mermaid tails. And you can get some really cool effects for that. And I may do that again this week, possibly if I get the time, with the Stamping Bella Tiny Towny Mermaid, just to show you that technique in a video and to show you how that comes out. As you can see, here's the bit where I was choosing which character. I wasn't quite sure exactly which one I was going to use. I just knew that I was going to use one that had a feather in her hair. And as you can see, there are a few. That's the reason that I chose to do the Distress Oxide technique, was that with this kit, they've got such fun outfits and just crazy sort of feathers and things in their hair. I just thought it would be perfect for doing Distress Oxide techniques with, as opposed to just Copic colouring. You will notice that I'm using a different stamp positioning tool. Usually I use my MISTI. However, because I'm working with a bare unmounted rubber stamp, I usually would use these with an acrylic block, which I have applied tack and peel to, so that I can use them as I normally would a cling mounted stamp. My Greeting Farm collection of stamps, and actually most of my rubber stamps, apart from my Stamping Bella stamps and a few others, are completely bare rubber, because in order to maximise on storage space, I unmounted everything. So all of my Greeting Farm stamps, as soon as they come in, I rip off the foam and store them in binders as just the bare red rubber. Of course, my MISTI is great for using with clear stamps and with cling mounted stamps. However, to use a completely bare rubber stamp, I would need to use either repositionable glue or remount my stamps. I don't really care for using repositionable glue with my MISTI because it's not cheap and I like to keep it fairly clean. And also I'm not a big fan of using repositionable glue just because it gets a little bit messy, and yeah, my preference is for using tack and peel with my acrylic blocks. However, I have been kind of spoilt by the MISTI, so now I pretty much, for almost all of my stamping, use the MISTI. So I really wanted to have the benefits of using the positioning tool, but be able to use it with my bare rubber. So because the MISTI isn't cheap, I picked this one up well, I'm not sure if it was on clearance. They are still available, I think, on Amazon, and I will pop a link. But it was significantly cheaper. And so I grabbed this and added tack and peel to the inside of that top plate. And now it works perfectly with my unmounted rubber stamps, and that's all I use it for because it has that tack and peel applied to the inside. So I use my MISTI for all of my other stamping, and this one is reserved for my red rubber, or basically any of my unmounted rubber stamps. Here you can see that now that I've done the stamping, I'm cutting out those feathers so that I can paper piece them, so I can layer them on top of my image when I've finished colouring it. As usual, I'm holding the piece and moving the scissors, holding my scissors straight and moving the paper in order to try and get the smoothest cut. And then I'm outlining the edges with a black brush marker just to kind of hide any imperfections. Then I stamped a mask on Eclipse masking paper, and I'm going to stamp the image on Make It Colour Blending card for Copic colouring. Again, there will be a link to this in the description below. It is my favourite paper for Copic colouring and has been for a number of years. I do sell it on my blog. That's where the link will be too. And yeah, I'm applying that mask, and I'm going to do some more Distress Oxide work, this time just using the blending tools, using a mini ink blending tool to create a Distress Oxide background, as you've seen me do a few times before if you have been watching my videos. I didn't use the ink smooshing technique because this paper doesn't stand up well to water. It is a very smooth paper. It's not designed for use with water-based mediums. However, it will stand up to a little bit of water as long as you're fairly careful with it. So I do use some water splatter and some pearlescent water in order to get a nice shimmery background and to get those oxidated effects with the Distress Oxides. It has actually been a while since I used any of my Greeting Farm stamps. They've been one of my favourite companies for so many years now, pretty much since they started. I think it was back in 2008, 2009, something like that. So yeah, I've got a huge collection of their stamps. I just, with all of the work that I do for Stamping Bella and life, I just generally don't seem to find enough time to do all of the stamping that I'd like to do. But I'm trying to make more of an effort to use some of my hoarded stamps because I really do love playing with them. The sort of open areas for colouring give quite a lot of opportunities for experimenting and practicing and creating some fun effects. So I do love playing with them. I will say that it's a bit, when I do so much colouring for, say, Stamping Bella, and you get into a bit of a groove with your colouring and sort of, you know, the characters tend to have fairly similar features, say if you're colouring like a Uptown Girl or whatever. So you tend to get into a bit of a groove with sort of how you colour, and it's a bit of a rhythm. So when you suddenly change that and you start colouring a completely different style, it takes a minute to just go, oh, hang on, what am I doing here? Which is what I was actually surprised that it came back to me fairly quickly, and colouring went fairly easily with this one. I was expecting, I haven't really coloured images with larger areas on the face, for example, for quite some time. So I was a little bit sort of hesitant, even though I've been colouring for so many years. So if you're a beginner and you feel hesitant and you feel a little bit like, oh, I'm not sure if this is, you know, I'm not sure if I'm any good at this, I'm not sure if I'm going to be able to do this. It still happens even when you've been colouring for quite a number of years. It's just that swapping between styles. At the moment, I'm feeling like I really need to get back into colouring some more realistic looking images. I obviously working with Stamping Bella and using some of the other cute stamp company images like the mama elephant, the greeting farm here, etc. I'm kind of very much in the mode of colouring very sort of simplistic, cartoonish looking images. So I really kind of need to make the effort to start practicing again and get back into colouring images with more detailed faces. Just because it's something that I love to do, but at the moment I'm finding myself a little bit sort of daunted by the prospect, because I'm like, am I going to remember how to do this? So yeah, it still happens even if you've been colouring for quite some time and you know, you have a vague idea about what you're doing. Sometimes you can still get a little bit daunted by the process, but I think it's important to remember, and I'm trying to remind myself this, it is all about the process. So enjoy the process, give it a go. At the end of the day, it's ink and paper. It's not the end of the world if it doesn't work out. Yeah, so I need to find a little portion of time where I haven't got too much time pressure to get things done, so that I can have a little play and reacquaint myself with some more detailed colouring. So hopefully I might manage to do that in the not too distant future. If it turns out terribly, I may or may not show you. Yeah, so if you're looking at an image, say like this one, and thinking, oh, you know, she's got that large face to colour, it's fine, just give it a go. It's just an area that you need to fill with colour, which can be daunting, but the best way to approach it is just to make a start and get going, and, you know, give it a couple of tries, and work out how it, you know, best goes for you. I would say that with the larger face area, try to work as quickly as possible if you're working with Copics. Try, in order to not get the streaky effect. So your markers need to be nice and juicy, and lay down colour fairly quickly. And work with the shape of the face. It tends to be a good idea to work with the shape of whatever you're colouring. So don't try and fill in the facial area by colouring in straight lines. Go with the curves of the face and you'll end up getting a much more natural look. I may think about it and do a more sort of in-depth video on this, because I know it's something that people often ask for. Here I've kind of sped up the colouring process, so it will be a little bit harder to see. But basically, yeah, working and building up colour, but working fairly quickly, keeping the area wet, because Copics blend best when the paper is wet. So using the ink and letting the ink do its thing, really. And another thing I'd say when colouring the skin tones is to be careful with the lighter colours, not to go in too far, not to work too far back over where you've applied some of the darker tones, because you can end up with kind of the speckly, splotchy look as the lighter colours start to push around the ink and cause some weirdness. The earth tones can be a little bit trickier and a little bit, they can behave in some different ways. They kind of do their own thing. They don't necessarily follow all the rules that the other colours families do. So yeah, and just colouring the hair here. Not trying to get too much detail in because it's not a very big area, but just having a little fun with it. I think I've mentioned before, hair is one of my favourite things to colour. And actually that's really why I'd like to make some time to colour some more detailed, larger images, like maybe some of the saturated canary digis that I've been hoarding. I've got a vast collection of those that I haven't coloured yet, which is a shame because I know that unfortunately they're no longer generally available. But I love colouring their hair. And it's something that is, I don't really get to do that with, say, the Stamping Bella stamps, which I still absolutely love. But I just don't get to do it to the same degree because they're smaller, they're more detailed. I love to get an image that's got a huge, long, flowing mane of hair and just spend an hour getting lost in colouring the hair. I find it really therapeutic for some reason. I know that's not the case for everyone. I know some people really dislike colouring hair. But yeah, I love it. Once I finish colouring the image, obviously I'm not colouring those feathers, you will see that I grab the feathers that I cut from the Distress Oxide piece that I created, and because I kind of have to fuss with everything, I grabbed some of my Polychromos coloured pencils to add some shading and detail just to that piece. Yeah, it's not necessary, but it just adds just a little bit of extra interest, a little bit of extra depth. I'm all about the details. I love adding extra, just little details with the shading, with the, colouring. If that's not your thing, the Distress Oxide feathers would be absolutely gorgeous without any extra details. I just, as I've said, I like to fuss. It's what I do. I also paper pieced the little sort of heart-shaped wings, I'm guessing they are. The little heart shapes coming out from the sides. I also paper pieced those from the Distress Oxide piece that I created. I don't add any shading to these though because they are so small. In fact, I'm quite impressed with myself that I actually bothered to paper piece those and fussy cut them, because fussy cutting fiddly little things is not my favourite thing to do. Yeah. In the end though, it looks fantastic. I love how it turned out. The effect is really beautiful. I love combining these paper piece Distress Oxide backgrounds with my Copic colouring. It's just, it adds something really fun and just really just makes an impact. It just adds so much interest that would be more difficult to achieve with just Copic markers. You could obviously colour the feathers with Copic markers and they would look beautiful. I just think that the effects that you can get and the ease with which you can get them with the Distress Oxides or Distress inks just makes it worth doing. And it saves time. I love Copic colouring, but sometimes it just makes sense to mix your media. So use your mediums to their best advantage. So colouring the background that I have behind her here, would have been more difficult with Copic markers, and it would have used quite a lot of ink. I do like sometimes colouring the backgrounds. However, I have found these days that I'm more likely to reach for my Distress inks, my Distress Oxides, and masking to create the backgrounds, just because it takes so much less time, it takes so much less ink, and it is so easy to get a really beautiful blended smooth result. So if colouring backgrounds like this with Copic markers is not your thing, if you find it stressful and frustrating, don't bother. Just mask and use Distress Oxide, Distress inks, whatever you have. There is nothing wrong with doing that, with combining the mediums to create something beautiful. It's just a way to use all those products that you've got to their best advantage. Copics, you can create beautiful backgrounds, but they're not necessarily always the best choice, and they're certainly not always the easiest choice. Here I'm kind of out of frame a bit, which I'll realise, yeah. I'm just outlining with a Copic multi-liner just to get that bold outline back, just where masking sometimes, because the mask isn't cut exactly perfectly, sometimes the Distress Oxide goes over those stamped lines, and because it is more opaque, because of those pigment properties, it'll make the lines more faded, more dull. Some of them will disappear almost entirely. So just using a multi-liner just to go over those. With the greeting farm images, that is really easy because they have such a bold outline and such a simple outline. Here I was just trimming the piece down, ready to pop it on my card. And as I have so often been doing recently, I'm layering it on some of that beautiful black sparkle cardstock from Paper Mill Direct here in the UK. I'm absolutely in love with this cardstock. I often like to use a black layer, a black matte layer, just to kind of frame the image and kind of draw your attention in. And I particularly love this black sparkle cardstock. It's just beautiful. I also grabbed a clear stamp set from My Favourite Things, which I've had for a while and hadn't got around to using. And I wanted to use that big, bold, beautiful U stamp at the top with one of the other stamps to create a sentiment. So actually I stamped this with Versamark ink and then heat embossed it with Ranger Liquid Platinum embossing powder. Here you can see I was just choosing which sentiments were going to work. And then I actually also stamped and heat embossed. I stamped the smaller words on some of the black sparkle cardstock and heat embossed on that as well. And then cut that up to arrange on the side of the card next to the character. And in the end, I didn't feel like the embossed sentiment stood out enough. So I just grabbed a multi-liner, and you'll see, actually I did this off camera. Yeah, I did it off camera. So you'll see in the card at the end, there is a black drop shadow sort of outline around the embossed U, which I felt just made it stand out just a little bit more from that background and kind of helped ground it a little bit. One of the things that annoys me a little bit sometimes about working with clear stamps is, especially when they're brand new, is the way that they stick to the cardstock. So it can be a little bit difficult when using the MISTI because it's pulling up the card. And I know it would probably help if I thoroughly cleaned them or primed them beforehand, but I'm a little bit lazy. So I always forget, and then I get annoyed when it happens. So don't be me. Prepare your stamps beforehand if this is going to bother you. Especially with such a large, bold stamp like this U stamp in this set. It turned out beautifully in the end though, and I really love that bold look for this card. And here's the smaller sentiment, which I stamped and I'm now cutting up. This is something I love to do, and you will have seen me do before if you have checked out my blog or videos previously. I love stamping sentiments and kind of chopping them up to create a different layout. I find this really helps me to create cards using sentiments, because so often the sentiment just doesn't fit where I want it. So this is a great way to make sure that you get the best use out of your sentiments. I'm just sticking everything down with my favourite liquid glue, which is Fabri-Tac. Again, this will be linked, like everything else, in my blog post, which will be linked in the description below. I will pop some links in the description below as well, but if you visit my blog post, you will find all of the information and all of the supply links. And that's pretty much it. I'm just going to assemble everything and glue it all down. And that will be that for this card. So thank you for joining me today. I hope you've enjoyed this video. If you have, please do like and subscribe. If you've got any questions, please do leave them in the comments section, either here on YouTube or over on my blog. I love to hear from you. And I will catch you next time.